We're going to start a couple minutes early. It seems like everyone's situated. So first of all, thank you for being here at the end of day 2 or day 3, depending on what time you arrived here at the MedTech conference. I know that we are standing in between you and the next reception, so we're going to try to keep this really lively to talk about this really important topic. Those of you who were here yesterday might have seen that there was another women's health panel over at the CEO's Unplugged stage. Great perspectives, speaking to a lot of the same topics that we'll be talking to. But at the same time, this panel is a little bit different, where we're pulling in different perspectives and different experts. So I'm really excited to eventually introduce you to the different panelists. But before we do that, I'll do a quick introduction of who your moderator is. My name is Moline Pondian, and I lead the Medical Technology Practice Lead with our mission-driven innovation consultancy known as RTI Innovation Advisors. Our focus is to help organizations think about how they invest and produce new technologies and innovations and products to help and benefit humankind. So not only do we look at how do you create a meaningful human impact, but also, is there a business case? How do you make it profitable? How do you make sure and ensure that there's long-term success on those technologies? So as we think about women's health, generally, it's been misunderstood as a small market historically. It's been traditionally severely underfunded, severely underrepresented, and it wasn't until 1993, until the NIH Revitalization Act, where women were required to be part of clinical trials. So that's 30 years. Fast forward to today, the percentage of women that are in clinical trials is only 30%. And that's a far cry from the global population of women, which is closer to 52%. But despite that, women make 80% of the medical purchasing decisions for their households. So there's truly a disconnect. Things are changing, although slowly. We have seen over the past couple of years an uptick in investment. I'll actually pull this up because I don't want to fumble the numbers, but recently RAND Corporation had done a study about the benefits of investing in women's health research for the WHAM report, the Women's Health Access Matters report. They say that investing in women's health research of $300 million US dollars can generate up to $13 billion in economic returns. So there is a business case. If you're not already working in women's health, consider that. Consider diversifying your product portfolio to really create and create technologies and solutions in this generally underserved market. So the goals of today's panel is to cover a couple of things. First of all, highlighting the past as well as current issues, that is innovating in women's health. Also to really demonstrate there is a business case to innovating in women's health, but then also share the resources, the lessons learned, some case studies through our panelists here today. So without further ado, I'd love to have the panelists introduce themselves. Maybe provide some additional context as to why are we here today in terms of being so behind in innovating for women's health, but then also by way of your introduction, what is your role in women's health? What is your organization doing to help spur innovation?
So my name is Elizabeth Scherow. I'm an OBGYN by training, so I'm delivering babies for the last 30 years, which is interesting on timing for that. I was a practicing practitioner, seeing patients every day through the pandemic and through up until really last year when I was running a private equity-backed OBGYN group in this country and decided to make a leap over to a non-for-profit. But you might think I might be crazy at that point because I became the chief medical officer, and then 6 months later, I'm now the CEO of the March of Dimes. And the exciting part about that is when I joined was the SASE, which I like to call, venture capital fund that we have that we started a year ago this September. So it's perfect timing to talk about this. And I love the lens that I bring to the organization from someone who's been trying to look at adoption And obviously the March of Dimes talks a lot about access and affordability. And really look at all of the programs, which I consider our venture fund, really one of our programs that we look through with the health equity lens. So, and that's who I am and kind of where we're going.
Wonderful. And I love that new perspective that you bring in terms of the March of Dimes. Dr. Schro did mention that this is her first time here at the MedTech conference, but what great time having that 1-year anniversary for your innovation fund and being able to share that resource to the community. So Eddie from the NIH.
So, hi, Eddie Billingsley from the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. In that division of NIH, I played a role of the Small Business Strategy Coordinator, so I oversee the small business activity at NIGMS. But I'm here to speak more to innovation and women's health from the NIH perspective. So prior to that, I was in the Office of Research on Women's Health. And we stressed in that office, a couple of things. So one, sex is a biological variable, where, kind of looking at women's health, not just from a maternal perspective, but considering, the biology of the woman, and really encouraging research using that variable. Additionally, we also want to consider the life course of a woman. So typically, again, it's around maternal health, but it doesn't really, we want to expand it to really consider all of the life phases of a woman. So I think those are a couple of opportunities in which we, would encourage, stakeholders to consider, innovations, considering those two key variables.
Thank you. Dave Uffer. I have dual hats now. I lead General Inception, which is a venture studio, and it's MedTech investing. It's a venture studio that invests the first institutional capital into pre-seed to seed stage companies, very early stage. And managing director of Trinity Life Sciences in their MedTech practice. We're strategy consulting. But my previous 25 years before these roles in healthcare has been purely in medtech, in strategics, leading strategy and business development. And since literally day one in my career, was working in fertility diagnostics. When I moved over to medtech and device, I was in fibroid management and breast health. I was Hologic corporate development, where we're leading acquisitions and minority equity investments and distribution arrangements, and through to my current role, leading investments and then working with companies. And I always say women's health is like the mafia. You can never get out. And it's a good thing because I'm completely impassioned with it, and I think we'll talk throughout the rest of the panel about why.
And Dave, what we really like about your perspective as an investor is that you're not just investing in women's health. There are funds that are out there very specific to women's health innovation, but you bring that perspective of, in your broader portfolio, you're not just investing in women's health, you're looking at other things too. So we'd love to, during the conversation, have you bring that out in terms of what you're looking for when you're investing in women's health. Tracy.
I'm Tracy McNeil. I am a recovering engineer. I started out as a chemical engineer in big pharma and then made the shift over to medical devices about 15 years ago. And I'm CEO of a company called Materna Medical, where we empower women to protect and restore their pelvic health. And I'm also a board member at AdvaMed and lead the Women's Health Equity Initiative, which we're just kicking off. I'm really excited about. I'll share more about it hopefully during the course of the panel. The company that I lead, Materna, has two products. The first is called Millie. It is available at hellomillie.com, and it serves a high-tone pelvic floor disorder that affects up to 17% of American women, called vaginismus. I'm guessing no one's heard of it, including a lot of the people who have it and the doctors that they see. So we're trying to change the standard of care along those lines, but I would say the product that everyone's more excited about is an intervention in obstetrics trying to prevent pelvic floor injury. And it's really a surrogate endpoint for prolapse later in life, but also reducing C-section rates and perineal lacerations. So there's a lot of work to do. I'm really excited. And I love this panel. I think I've got connections, I know some of you anyway, and I will say it is an incredibly small world and a lot of fun.
Sonal.
Thanks, Marlene, for kind of bringing, again, again, this really interesting panel together. So I actually represent a little bit more of the mature side of the industry. I work for a large strategic, Hologic, as a vice president of corporate development. So for those of you who may not be familiar, Hologic is a large company, diversified from a technology standpoint in diagnostics, imaging, and surgical, but primarily focused on women's health, so about $4 billion in sales. So excited to talk a little bit today about business cases, because there's certainly an incredibly exciting business case to talk about. In terms of the role that I play, I'm certainly focused a little bit in terms of M&A activity, but the company of Hologic has really been built on two things. First, inorganic innovation through acquisitions of many small companies that have kind of come through all of these investments and matured. And then also organic investments as well in R&D. So some of those examples are really the foundation of our company, started in osteoporosis screening. That's really the core of it. And then we sort of built on that X-ray-based DEXA technology and expanded into breast screening through mammography, through a series of technology acquisitions. That then kind of diversified even further through our Cytech acquisition, which expanded us into cytology for cervical cancer screening, as well as abnormal uterine bleeding. And then we really just continued on there to expand even further into molecular diagnostics through our GenProbe acquisition, which is very much focused on STI screening, which we know is kind of mostly done through the female population. And so we've continued along that journey through a number of acquisitions, but also a lot of R&D, in terms of bringing new technology to market, going from 2D mammograms to 3D mammograms, and really kind of enhancing each of the segments that we play in. So excited about the conversation that we have today.
Yeah, and Sonal, you represent a large entity, a large strategic that has used women's health as the core starting point for decades of your business. And we had started, and you'd mentioned this a little bit earlier, Sonal, about that business case for women's health innovation. Not everyone gets it. A lot of times they're looking at past examples of exits, but with women's health, there's not that many examples. So in your own words from the panelists, and feel free to go in any order, what is your opinion in terms of how do you describe that business case? Investors are looking at the return on investment to make sure that what they're investing in, is recuperated at a minimum, but at the same time can demonstrate that there's going to be impact as well. So, how do you describe your business case? I know, Tracy, being at Materna, you've been very successful with fundraising. How do you make that communication in terms of the business case for your sector?
It's changed a lot just in the 4 years since I took over. So I'm not the founder of Materna. I'm what they call the hired gun. So I worked in other verticals before Materna. This was my first foray into women's health. And I would say when I first started, so we raised a seed round and then an A and then a B. And we're a fast company. We've been featured in Forbes. Everybody's really excited about it. And I do think we're in a really, a bit of a corner property in women's health. But I would say in the beginning, I was still getting sort of the last remnants from investors of women's health as a niche. And here, 3 years later, I would say that I really didn't hear that from anybody. I mostly saw from investors that they're pretty aware that it's half the population. And they've even seen it in the news. And trying to figure out, so what I think and I'm sure other folks have something to add to this, so maybe I'll just pass the baton with, I think they're trying to figure out, investors are pattern seekers and pattern followers. So they want to know all the people who've made a lot of money in your space, and because of the underinvestment, that pattern's a little weak in women's health. And so I think we're not on the bleeding edge anymore, but I definitely say we're still on the leading edge. And so there have been some really important exits in the space that I think have gotten people excited. The exit in particular with the Lydia and the Jada device to change the way we treat postpartum hemorrhage was really a great North Star for us. But I bet other folks have something to say about that.
As an investor, it is a follow the pattern market. That they want to see that there's traction in the market, that there's acquirers, that there's exit pathways. And you're right, Lydia did help in the others that Hologic has made in laparoscopic surgery dedicated to fibroid management in other areas. We see multi-billion-dollar acquisitions in IVF. That's still women's health, though people don't believe it. I think in the last
I
few
know
years.
fertility is
Yes.
actually very well funded. It's like the one thing people feel good about funding.
Correct. And still very good growth that we see a little bit more established in Europe, and I think we're starting to see patterns where it's expanding significantly here. And it is well funded there. And because of those massive exits, people, again, the patterns that you were describing, they follow, the investors follow that. But I look at it, we will see this groundswell. I'd been in urology for years before Hologic, and looking at a dearth of investment there because there were not technologies being advanced. And look at the multi-billion dollars of exits that have gone in urology in the last 5 years, and investors are just writing checks left and right. So I think it takes some momentum, and then we exacerbate.
Sona, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think similar to trade, I always think it's a funny question. Of course there's a business case. First of all, the population is incredibly large. And I like to say case in point. I mean, you can have scaled businesses. I mean, Hologic is the example of that. And as I kind of described in my intro, I mean, it was really kind of a conglomeration of a number of really interesting acquisitions that had scaled over a period of time and that we kind of put together in sort of this women's health mission and ecosystem. But there was a tremendous amount of hard work that kind of went into that. I think the one thing that I would share that maybe I didn't fully appreciate until I joined Hologic and worked in the women's health space is so much of women's health is actually population-based health. So previous, I sort of worked in the symptomatic world in orthopedics, neurosurgery. You get diagnosed with a brain tumor, you sort of go down a particular path. And yeah, they're high-value cases, but they're rare, right? I mean, it's not like, the huge population. I think one of the things I've learned about women's health is when you actually innovate and you get it right, it actually unlocks a huge market all at once. So if we think about STI screening, if we think about fibroid management, these are really large markets. If you think about fibroids, affects 80% of women at some point in their lifetime. STI screening is now kind of an opt-out. Like literally, if you go into the doctor's office at a certain age, you're going to get screened. So these are massive markets that sort of, if you do all of the right work to be able to kind of unlock those markets, and it's tough stuff, right? You have to get into guidelines, you have to get into standards of care, but once you do that, you get access to these huge population bases. So from a business case standpoint, incredibly attractive.
And Dr. Shiro, now that you're at the 1-year anniversary of your Innovation Fund, right, you have several companies under your belt within the Innovation Fund, but you're also looking at a lot of different companies. What do you look for that business case story?
It's a great question. And I would say the maternal space is now kind of coming up right behind the infertility space. There are lots of point solutions in different spaces, but I start, especially as a provider, start to think about that population you're talking about. To me is like the no-brainer, right? Just what you said. But getting back to what March of Dimes is doing, when we started our fund, the idea was really we have great donors who are in the VC space who really wanted to take startups to commercialization so that we're not in that valley, right? And can we use the network of the March of Dimes to be able to do that? Because we are if you don't know, we have an 85-year history. This is FDR asked all Americans to help solve for polio. So, and then we had the hard problem of actually, we funded that research that solved for the polio vaccine. So then what happens, right? So we were kind of the first crowdsourcing, is what I like to say. And since we did solve for it, we then switched to disabilities, preterm birth, birth defects, and then eventually into the maternal healthcare space. So our history is kind of interesting of where we've gone. We have a ton that we focus on in research. We do a ton on data, which I would say is missing, especially as a provider who's been doing this for so long. And I think about all the fetal heart rate monitoring I've been doing and all that data that should have been collected, and opportunities that I missed, but that's a different conversation. But then moving towards what we do best about education is, could we pull in what we do and really think about ending, preventable maternal death, and which we know the data is out there. And if you don't know, it's really going in the wrong direction, especially for Black and brown women in this country. And could we affect that? And that's how we look at it. And that's the lens we use. So we have a strong but mighty fund that we closed 3 companies, and I'm excited to see each of them really getting very quickly accelerated through really our investment and sort of the stuff we can do in kind. And so we look through those lenses. Not everything has to be a huge success, but we could push some of the science further. But at the same time, I should also say it's not because we're a non-for-profit. It's not to sustain the March of Dimes. It's really to sustain the fund, and that hopefully we go on to the next fund. So that's how we look at it, which is kind of exciting to be in that space.
Absolutely. One thing that I wanted to make sure that the audience walked away with is an understanding of the resources and the programs and the initiatives that each of you represent and are a part of. So I'd love for each of you to share some of the work that either your organization is doing, either within your company, or maybe some of the work that you're doing with AdvaMed. As well, Tracy, you're leading the new Women's Equity Initiative. So if you can share with that and others as well, in terms of especially the newer innovators, or maybe some of the companies that are the larger companies that might be able to leverage some of the great work that you've already created.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk about it. And I want to just say, how many people in the room is this your first time to the MedTech conference? Oh, that's so exciting. Well, welcome. And I will say, this is the progress we've made along these lines at the board level and at just the way AdvaMed leads it's a different place than it was 5 years ago. I love the commitment and the infrastructure that they're putting in to make sure that we are actually addressing these equity issues, because there were papers that were written 20 years ago that read like they were written today, and we really haven't made progress. These are old problems where we haven't really moved the needle. And so when they asked if I would take over the Women's Health Equity Initiative, I was like, well, maybe what does that mean, right? Because OBGYN, sure, that's women's health, but I would argue that if your company serves women, you're in women's health. And that's really the lens that we're taking as we're beginning to pull together the member companies. We'll start by getting awareness of all the work that is being done, but also distinguishing that women's health is not just OBGYN and things that only exclusively affect women, but also things that disproportionately affect women, like all autoimmune diseases and migraines, and there's a lot of things in that category, and then things that affect women differently. Cardiology being probably the most obvious example, that heart attacks affect women differently. We're diagnosed later, and we die more easily, sooner. So beginning to pull together all the member companies to begin to align on what we have done well, but also get really crisp about what the KPIs are that we're addressing. Because I'd rather pick KPIs that are very clear that might take us 20 years to change than pick something squishy where we don't know if we're making any difference. And so we're just at the beginning stages, but if there's anybody in the audience that wants to know more, I'll be happy to talk about it afterwards.
So the NIH has recently, and it's actually quite timely because it's happening right now over at the Grand Challenges, they have been working in partnership with the Gates Foundation to do something that they call an IEF, Innovation Equity Forum opportunity map related to women's health. Eddie, can you talk to us a little bit more about what that is? I know that they just recently released the report as of 2 days ago, so to talk to us about how might the audience members, the community, use that report and those findings.
Right. So we did, NIH worked with the Gates Foundation. This began earlier this year, actually, to kind of bring together key opinion leaders across a spectrum of different organizations, because they recognize, both groups actually recognize, the paucity of innovation going on in women's health research. I mean, beyond the obvious that we've just mentioned up here today. And so they came together. They brought these key opinion leaders together and broke them out into separate groups to create this opportunity map. So the opportunity map really is to guide stakeholders in thinking about how how to address innovation in the women's health space from a variety of different perspectives, female-specific conditions, communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases and conditions. And as Moline mentioned, they're also having a meeting right now in Dakar because this is also to be a global thing. So it's just not a U.S. problem, it's a global problem. And these two entities are coming together to help address that.
In terms of the IEF, or the Innovation Equity Forum, I know I sat in on one of the calls that the Gates Foundation led and NIH led, and it's truly a global participation too, in terms of not only collecting the information, finding the opportunity maps, but then also disseminating that, distributing it, and so that there's a global impact and footprint.
Yep.
So Hologics has done the Women's Health Index. Tell us more about that, Sonal, in terms of what was done and built, and how are people using the Women's Health Index?
Yeah, I think, we traditionally as medtech folks always think about product innovation, right? Because that's just our pedigree. We got to come up with a way to solve this technologically and then kind of roll that out. But I think one of the interesting things about women's health is that we're sort of at the infancy of just reaching everyone. And so I think we've really had this realization that, yes, we actually are fortunate in certain swim lanes. We still have a lot of work to do. But in certain swim lanes, we actually do have some very good solutions, some good gold standard technology, very accurate, good sensitivity, specificity to be able to get good decision making out. But we're really not reaching everyone, right? I think the traditional focus of the medtech industry, started with academic medical centers and then going to community medical centers and developed markets. But if you think about, the overall global population, how do we bring this to more women with existing technology? Because that's an efficient use of capital, because we already invented something over many decades. And so how do we bring it to more people? And that's really kind of what spurred on this whole idea of expanding access. And I think one of the tricky things is, how do you do that? Right? A lot of, I kind of spoke a little bit earlier, a lot of this is around population-based health, right? And so to be able to spur these things on, you really need to be able to tap into kind of government level, country level, key decision makers to be able to kind of bring population health down to the masses. But in order to do that, how do you have that conversation, let's say with the health minister of country X? You can't just go in and say, hey, buy my widget, let's set up a contract. You actually have to have a language around that. And that's really the spirit of the Global Women's Health Index. It's a partnership through Gallup, a survey that we launched to 120,000 women worldwide to be able to collect insights on all aspects of women's life, not just specific things that Hologic would be interested in, but general health, kind of what is top of mind, what is kind of precluding people from getting the health care that they need, so that we would actually be armed with the statistics that would then kind of we could bring forward to the right conversations. And so to be able to have, so it's kind of like what you measure is what you can achieve, right? If you can't measure it and talk about it, then you're not going to be able to influence. And so we've been able to capture such rich data, country level data about emotional well-being, physical well-being, access to care, whether it's emotional, physical, mental, whatever it may be, and actually bring those to kind of country level stakeholders to kind of bring that conversation forward. A nice little anecdote is, this is years ago, of how a single point of influence can change things for many people. So in Europe, if you think about mammography over time, it went from film mammography to 2D mammography to 3D mammography. And it took a lot of time and years for that kind of transformation to happen. But particularly in Europe, right, I think it took a lot longer. Regulations are different, reimbursement is different. But there was a single point of influence in Iberia with this kind of founder owner of Zara, the clothing line, who had a particular personal connection to breast cancer. Someone in his family was diagnosed with breast cancer. And after that experience, actually ended up self-funding an entire country's worth of upgrades to 3D mammography. So, yes, we can think about it in a traditional lens, which is, sales rep goes out to hospital and does the traditional sale, but what if we could actually influence global populations on a macro level in more of a step change? So that's really the spirit of that, and also some of the other sponsorships that we're doing to kind of raise the profile with the WTA sponsorship or Mary J. Blige to kind of get the message out there in an accessible way.
So is that index available to the general public, or how do you access that information?
Yeah, it's on our website. So we have, it's available to anyone. Actually, we want everyone to kind of be able to utilize it, not just Hologic, because I think it's going to be able to benefit the entire women's health ecosystem to be able to have these conversations. As I said, it's not Hologic, it's sponsored by Hologic, but it is not Hologic specific. So it covers all different aspects of health for women's health. So being able to use that as a resource, we highly encourage anyone to be able to kind of take that and kind of use the data from that to support your business cases.
Thank you. It's great to hear that you invested in doing that for the greater good in terms of women's health innovation. And it was great that you provided that example as how that index was able to change even a full country in terms of how they were treated. So I learn best by examples and case studies and lessons learned. And I've asked the panelists to share maybe one or two different examples as to success in women's health innovation, whether it's through partnerships, whether it's through commercializing a technology in the women's health space or maybe outside of that and moving it into women's health. Share with us a success story or some lessons learned that you've had that the audience can take in related to women's health innovation, and then also building that business case and making that happen. Who wants to go first?
I'll start. I'm going to do a shout out to Eddie and the NIH, because Materna won a $2.2 million NIH fast track grant just before my tenure. I did nothing for it at all. I just benefited. And we were able to survive COVID and gave me enough runway to raise the next round and get through it. But we absolutely would not be a company. I wouldn't be sitting here without the NIH. It's very important use of your tax dollars.
I guess follow that up.
You're welcome.
So yeah. So we had the RADx Maternal Health Challenge prize. That was an $8 million prize that went out to develop maternal health innovations. And we funded about 12 investigators, about half of those women. So I think that was a success in terms of getting more women into the fold and doing something for maternal health as a result.
Absolutely. Any other examples?
So we have, well, I have a couple because I only have three, but one of ours has, in the infant health space, has just won the RADx. So I got to, right, it's like we're all leaning into NIH for continuous blood pressure monitoring in newborns. But I would also, so exciting about that, but switching a little bit, we also started our first investment with something in Iron Health. Iron Health is a wraparound service for women in the OBGYN office to really, especially in that postpartum space, to lean in where we know 80% of those deaths are preventable, thinking about 50% of those are in that postpartum space, thinking about how do we change those outcomes. And so we invested in Iron Health. And they are actually launching, as I said, in West Texas, actually I think the end of this month, which is really exciting to see them actually get to and into patients' hands. But I think for us, our lens is, I leaned into this a little bit, but looking at, we were looking at lots of things that funnel through. We scale them because we've got a science med-sci committee and I've got an innovation committee, and they have to agree. And some of them look at the business case very differently on both sides. Very interesting to sit a whole bunch of academics together, by the way, and have a general practitioner who's been in private practice to have that conversation. So I love that we're able to do that, come up with a scorecard evaluation, but then also look at it as what is the outcomes going to be. So we may look at something that, and again, we are about Series A. The rest gets a little complicated for us to be able to do, but thinking about how do we look at outcomes? How do we invest in something that will definitely have value in the future? And we try and use that. I think we all do, but that's where we start to look at that business case of, especially as the March of Dimes, could we just be advancing science? We may not get that exit, but we actually think this will push the envelope further. And so I love that I'm able to do that and be able to use that. But so that's one of the, but we really like to make sure that, eventually we do need a return. So, because I have to talk to donors, right? It might be worse than investors. So,
Dave, do you have any good success stories?
Investing in areas that weren't just purely therapeutic, but they were patient-friendly in access to procedures. So I've invested in a company that has a catheter that accesses the uterine cavity, crosses the cervix in a pain-free way where you're not taking the tenaculum, grabbing the cervix, and in decades-old technology that was used to remove bullets from people who would get shot and providing counter-traction on the cervix. This is the archaic technologies that we still have in women's health because they don't think of the patient, they think of the procedure. So I'm really proud of this company that's getting painless and very easy access into the uterine cavity, whether you're delivering any type of technology or therapeutic. And those are the areas where you don't think, well, what disease is it treating? No, it's treating the patient in a more humane and accessible way and giving the clinician the confidence to be able to perform the procedures that are a little bit more difficult for them and don't have a great patient experience. And then the patients don't show up. I mean, as much as it is delivering good technology and delivering good therapy, it's making it amenable to the patient that they are not either afraid or think or hear that these are horrible procedures, and you might want to look at something that's less effective because it's not as terrible a process to go through.
Yes.
Dave, I just want to capture that soundbite. They think about the procedure, not the patient. And I think that was underneath so much of particularly what was the origin of OBGYN. It's just painful, racist, sexist origins that need to be healed.
At the Women's Leadership conference that we had in California last year, we had a keynote speaker that actually went through the history of OBGYN from 170 years ago when the discipline started, and it's...
Yeah, for those in the audience, if you haven't seen the documentary Aftershock, highly recommend, must see. I think it's on Hulu. You can get a free 7-day trial if you're not.
No, it's actually, it is on Hulu.
Where is
Tanya
it?
Lee, producer, is on my board. So, March of Dimes. So
Small
I
world.
had to push that even further. Yeah.
Small world. So I'd love to open up for some questions from the audience, if you have any, whether it's about accessing some of the resources or support that we've heard, or any questions that you might have from the panelists. Feel free to walk to the stage.
Hello. I actually have a question that is similar or touches on what both of you were just talking about. How, when you're developing things like these KPIs you're talking about for your initiative, or just innovation in general, what is your plan of attack, or how are you strategizing around a lot of the misinformation and exploitation of these gaps that are, or shortcomings basically, that women are left with in the healthcare industry? I think it's we see that just as humans, but also in our job. So I think as an engineer, I'm just curious as how can you address that, or how have you been able to? The misinformation and stuff like that.
I'll start with what we're thinking about at ABAMED and this particular initiative. So it's a bunch of things, right? So the underrepresentation in clinical research, this is a KPI we can measure, but then the question is, how do we change it? And so what I'm expecting to do with the member companies is to ask them all to come to the first subcommittee meeting and say, what is the one challenge that your company is trying to address in women's health? And what are the 2 superpowers you're bringing to the table? in terms of resources you can do. Do you have bandwidth in public affairs? Do you have mountains of voice of customer data? Because for the most part, we're not competitors at all. Most of us aren't even touching on the same things, but we all have the same issues, right? The lack of reimbursement in women's health products, right, forces a lot of these companies into consumer models which don't fit most of the strategic companies that are here. And then even though they're doing something good for patients, there isn't a channel for that product to drop into. That's dysfunctional. We have to address, so that's going to be a long, that's not fast. I just want to manage everyone's expectations. CMS, it's literally acts of Congress to change CMS. So, but this is the group that does that. We do that. And it's time that we made that a priority and reported on it to the board every quarter until it's right.
On that note, Tracy, I think we get a misnomer, and I'm a medtech snob, in that I draw a big delineation between medtech healthcare versus wellness. And we're starting to get this impression in women's health that it's a lot of technologies that are wellness. These are not consumer products. There's a consumer element, that's for sure. That's okay. But I look at it, they have to be clinician-directed technologies and products that make them healthcare. And too many investors are thinking, well, that's wellness, or all of these technologies are the digital technologies, it's wellness, that's women's health. That's a different sector. Think about the devices in the digital health and the diagnostic products that we're bringing to healthcare for women-specific conditions or conditions that affect women that aren't, again, as you said, OBGYN.
No, absolutely. I mean, so as an example, when we went to get build a reimbursement pathway for our first product that's treating a condition that's essentially the number one symptom is painful sex for women, which affects 1 in 3. 1 in 3. The first 3 reimbursement people I talked to said, well, you're never going to get a code for that because that's going to be perceived as cosmetic. So I didn't stop there. We're still working on it. We're going in through Medicare supplemental benefits, which people still have to pay for. But I got a lot of skepticism, like, well, are people over 65 really still having sex? It's like, what is going on? So I ran some research. And 350 people, 19% of men said that they were avoiding sex because their wife had too much pain. 16% of women said they were avoiding it because it was too tight and it hurt. It's a very common symptom of menopause. And people over 65 want to have sex. So we just have to keep going until we get this right.
I just want to add a comment to, man, you're so spot on with this, because if a man said he couldn't have sex because it was painful,
It's a birthright.
It's
Viagra.
we could, we just know the answer. It would absolutely be a clinical problem, right? Women have pelvic congestion. Been told, oh, that's not really a clinical problem. That's not a. So that's the first thing, right? They have to recognize that our problems, though different than male problems, are legitimate, and they are, as David said, they are clinical issues. That's not a wellness issue if you're having pain, right? Pain is associated with the malfunction in the body. Right, and so we're going to get you that reimbursement. So I'm going to put this out because Sunday when they had the women's meeting, the big question that I heard from a lot of people afterwards was, where were the men? They control all of these companies. They're the ones that set the agenda on what we're going to focus on and how we're going to do it, right? A lot of women's health companies are completely dominated by men. How do we get them to learn to think differently about it? Because I think that's going to be the key. Without those key stakeholders at the table and being a part of the solution, things just aren't going to change. Or it'll be a constant battle every step of the way. David is, I've known him for a long time, MedTech. He is a rare exception. But that's the question. How do we get the men at, I won't call their names, but at the biggest companies to say, we have to change and make a real commitment to women's health. And we have to listen to the women about the problems, right? What are their clinical unmet needs? And let's support that. So I don't know, you guys tell us, how do we get them there?
Great question.
Well, that was outlined in the opportunity map, right? So that's one of that was under training and education, because that, I think, is a component as well. Training, clinicians, scientists to really think more about women's health and how their research can benefit it. I can say for myself as a neuroscientist, once I studied autism, and obviously, there are more men that get autism than women, but women still get it, right? So, and we will always encourage, well, to make it easier, just exclude all the female mice or rats or whatever, animal model we're using, and just focus on the males. But again, women are still getting autism, so it would have been helpful to at least include the female mice, again, to, try to understand, even if there's a distinction, and maybe that's something to follow up on research-wise. So I think education, within the context of research study, clinical study, has to involve women's health. And additionally, men have to be allies, and that's one of the points that they make in the opportunity map, that we, have to make a strong push to encourage men to have allyship with women and women's health issues.
I think we could have an entire day symposium on this, and I think even at the clinician side, and I'd love to hear from Dr. Schro. When I was looking at incontinence, I went into a lot of our clinical advisors and said, I want to see your survey and your intake form and the discussion lines that you have, and ask your patients, when was your last menstrual cycle, and ... weight, you're looking at your blood pressure, and I said, why haven't you asked your patients how they're doing with incontinence? Are they having any issues with that? That's one of the leading issues there, dyspareunia. Everything that we are talking about that are the conditions that are underrepresented, underfunded, and undertreated are under-discussed at the clinician and patient level, because perhaps there's stigma, perhaps there's not solutions for them, perhaps there's not that dialogue and trust to get honest feedback, but it has to start with the patients being comfortable and trusting with their clinicians. And I will say the clinicians asking their patients about these issues, because there are solutions to that, and if they're not optimal, at least it's an option. Your impressions there?
I have so much to say, but did you want to say something beforehand?
No, I think, we talked a little bit earlier about certain disease states kind of having great gold standard technology. And I think one of the things that is exciting for me, Tracy, you kind of alluded to it, like this kind of change within the last 5 years in terms of investors kind of looking at different areas. It's wonderful, right? Because if we think about, everything that happened with, morcellation and pelvic mesh, and having some of the other strategics kind of leave the space, because of very significant issues. But if you think a lot of that innovation that was coming out of those companies who maybe had exited, they're kind of in very distinct swim lanes. I think what I'm loving now is really the diversity of disease conditions that are actually being considered. And yes, some of them may be wellness, right? But you're thinking about somebody holistically. I think the question will be, how do you bring that business case forward? Because when you start to go from traditional medical device, which is what we are all trained in, and go into some of these other areas which are a little bit more adjacent or, subjective, let's just say, you really have to understand what's the clinical efficacy of the solution, because it may not be that gold standard. It may be, like incontinence is a great example of something that's incredibly difficult to treat. There have been so many attempts at it, and there are imperfect solutions. But to your point, I think it's understanding that not every medical technology has to be at that 100% level to bring value to an entire population. People need options. What may work for one woman may not work for another. And so to be able to have a repertoire almost, or a portfolio of options available, accepting that different standard, if you will, I think will be important as we kind of explore some of these other areas that don't have that clear reimbursement code, or that clear, treats 95% of incontinence patients perfectly, right? But we still need solutions.
I wasn't avoiding your question. But as a provider, you're absolutely right. I think if you aren't asking the questions, you're not going to have, right? And there's so many questions that a provider has to ask, which we, and I said it's we, but I have to be very careful, right? As a provider, you're thinking about how do I get in and out of this room, right? Get the necessary information, bill accordingly, chart accordingly, at some point do a physical exam. So I do think incontinence, and I would say it's bubbled up from the technology side to ask the questions, which is the wrong place for it to come. Addressing your question specifically, and I guess I'm like the physician who's going to say, we need to get more women in some of these places. We need more diversity in them too. And how do we do that is a bigger question. I was on a council for the National Medical Association about just this. And I will say that there are spaces that are working very hard at doing that, which is, if you don't know about, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, but it's super exciting to see. What is scarier was when you look at OBGYNs, I'm not speaking about midwives or others, but really OBGYN, we know there's going to be a paucity, right? That's been well documented that, we don't have enough providers out there, and we don't have enough diverse providers. I was lucky enough when I went into this field that most were women. They were not diverse, right? And then we're slowly making changes, but we actually have to affect way earlier in the pipeline, right, down at the high school level. To your point about time, right? That's where it's going to take time to move that.
Great, and I see another question.
Well, hello and good afternoon. I am so pleased to see this panel here, so congratulations on that. I really want to touch upon this aspect of how do we broaden the footprint of health of women? How do we make sure that that everyone understands that you're already operating in this health of women space? So I do want to speak to that. And to make sure that we work with you. I am Terry Cornelison. I am Chief Medical Officer, Associate Director for the Health of Women at CDRH FDA, and the Director of the Health of Women Program at CDRH FDA, a program that we built and lead across the entire center. The program is based on the premise that sex and gender has an impact on the whole of women's health, because every cell is sexed, every person is gendered, gender being an entire spectrum that can be fluid. And so the question is, how does this have an impact on your intervention? And we are asking this question across the entire medical device ecosystem. And so my point being that if your intervention touches a woman, you are already operating in the health of women's space. And it's because we understand that, for instance, sex has an impact on the entire exome. The entire exome. It has an impact on course and conditions that impact all organ systems of the body. So yes, health of women is that arena where we address conditions that have an impact solely on women, but also the arena where we have an impact on all conditions that women experience. This is human health, folks. This is personalized medicine. And again, if your intervention touches a woman, you are already operating in the health of women's space. So the question is, how can you do this better? Data generation, I love this. Let's make sure that we can amplify the data that you have that strengthens the argument, the scientific argument, that this is the space you need to move in, and letting that be the drivers. Not only in the cardiology space, the neurology space is huge in the health of women's space, with the distinctions and differences and variations, the differences in biomarkers for Alzheimer's, sex-based differences, distinctions in biomarker development. So it's changing the language, if you will, the messaging, that all of this is health of women. We are already moving in the health of women's space. Let's do it better. How can your intervention have better performance and safety? Better for all the lives that it touches. Better, all right? And then do it together. Let's partner. We want to amplify your message, work with you, be strong advocates and alliances in this space. Thank you for the RADx project. Okay, very well aware of that. And to all of you, thank you so very much, and everyone in the room as well. But let's continue this conversation. But I thank you for that, because we at the FDA are constantly moving forward and trying to have everyone recognize that we are head to toe health of women, women's health, and that this is, we're all already a part of this. Thank you.
I think she needs to be up there.
I'm gonna borrow a line from, so the NIH sponsored a maternal health workshop back in May, and I loved this comment. Like, women's health affects us all because we were all birthed by our mothers, right? So think about that impact and that implication of the experience that your mother had. It will affect you, whether it's directly or indirectly.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I'm a young engineer from Edwards Life Sciences. Thank you so much for speaking with us. As people that are in the women's health space, how has your, I guess, philosophy and strategy on your business kind of pivoted or changed as, I guess, the question of bodily autonomy, especially when it comes to women, has now become one of the talking factors when it comes to like politics and government?
Great question. Just year after year, we've seen a difference. We see that it's more on center stage in terms of the topics. So I'd love to see if anyone wants to take that question.
So you're referring to Dobbs and the ripples of that, or do you want to just say a little bit more about your question?
I guess, yes, the implications of those like Supreme Court cases, and also future possible implications of these cases. How do they affect women's health on the whole, and how much we're able to innovate in this space?
Without getting my foot on the third rail here.
I'll admit I misinterpreted that question, so I'm glad that you add that clarification.
I'll start with something bold and provocative, because it's been my thought since I came here. And we're talking about women's health and expecting people to drive new innovations and offer new procedures and let women be part of that selection with their clinicians. And it's not just technology, it's not just companies, it's not leadership, it's our whole social fabric. And if socially we're not going to respect women who can choose life or choose other options with their own bodies and their reproductive health, if we're not even respecting them to make those choices, how can we advance their medicine? So I'll start there. And it's really disappointing where we are to respect women, to offer women options and let them be part of that decision making. And we're seeing choice after choice, not just in reproductive health, being taken away. And we need to fight to keep that there, both in medicine and socially. And that makes it difficult for companies to offer technologies. I was asked to, when I was in investment banking recently, to help a company divest of technology for removal of product of conception. And we're not innovating there, we're not offering other alternatives, and nobody wants to touch this because they don't know if there's a business case there. We can't even train clinicians to offer that as a service in the places where it's still available. So we do have massive social issues, and I think we all have to fight for it.
So just to be clear, ACOG regards abortion as an essential part of women's care. That's the clinical, and I'm sure Dr. Schro has a lot more to say about that than I do. I'll just speak from because I think each one of us has a different way we can intervene on the negative cycle that's been going. And so I think entrepreneurs have a very special place on the wheel. I think it's incredibly important to be involved in the press. I think the press is, the fourth part of the, legislative, executive, right, judicial, and free press. So I think that, and we've seen this as a success story. So Alidia was really a sister company. We were both forward innovation companies, both founded the same year, had a lot of the same long, sad road of being told women's health isn't an issue. And specifically, they were told by many investors and many hospitals, postpartum hemorrhage isn't a problem in this country, right? And it was the press that changed that. It was people stepping forward, Serena Williams, people stepping forward and telling their stories of almost dying in this incredibly unequitable system to finally out the issue. And it's still not done, right? People still don't fully understand it. It's embarrassing for providers. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And I think there are a lot of things in this space that are in that situation, because when we think about really changing that, I mean, the macroeconomic reality is there aren't enough providers. And so for a technology like mine to show up and be like, hey, you want to know how to grow your practice? By taking care of more patients, they're like, I don't have any nurses. I'm working, 8 days a week. I'm not actually solving their problem. And then the patient isn't left with better access. So I don't see a quick answer to that, but I do think that the press is a really important one, so we got to make some noise.
I think from any angle, I think empowering women, I think to be knowledgeable about their bodies, to understand their options, and to also, Global Women's Health Index is really about kind of not just empowering senior leaders to understand women's health, but it's for all of us to understand our bodies and women's health, but also champion that relationship with healthcare practitioners. That's an important bond. That's where a lot of the education comes from. But then also kind of modifying that information to make sure that maybe not everyone has access to the traditional healthcare practitioner. One of the things that we've learned also is, things that we take for granted, right? That, okay, I can take a day off from work and I can get a particular procedure or a mammogram or whatever it might be. Not everyone has access to those resources. They may have to take a day off of work. That may not be an option for them. Maybe they don't have transportation, right? So when we talk about empowerment of women, it's coming from many different angles so that they can kind of raise up their voices, but then also get connected to the right resources, because I do think having that strong clinician and relationship is central to any kind of healthcare.
So just to point to what March of Dimes is doing specifically, we actually focused on getting access for women, and we actually, just to take a step back, and it's not, you may all not think it's innovative, I think it's fantastically innovative, is that mobile units, there's only 2% of mobile units in the United States are focused on maternal health. So what did we do? We stepped up, and we actually launched mobile units in Appalachia, in West Texas, in Arizona, in Washington, D.C., and we're launching our next in New York City. And we're bringing providers, because we are not providers. I am, but the rest of March of Dimes is not, right? So we're a convener. I always like to talk to us. Somebody asked me this. I don't know, what's one of the Women's Health Initiative conferences, innovation conferences, was what lane does the March of Dimes swim down? And I always love to say we are the swimming pool. We like to people in their lanes and bring them together. I could keep going with we need clarity, we need it to be warm, all that kind of analogies in a lifeguard, but I'm gonna leave all that alone. We really like to convene and be the leader in a space, and I don't wanna own mobile units, because I could see it as Dr. Chareau's, mobile units across the country, but we wanna make sure that they're sustainable and scalable, and bring partners together to be able to hand them off in 3 years to be able to continue that care. But we are really focused got our board behind making access one of the biggest things that we could do, of just getting maternal care where there is none. So that's where we changed our strategy.
Great. I know that we have about 10 more minutes, but I'd love to maybe round out this panel by asking each of the panelists, we'll kind of go down the line or go in any order that you'd like, what is that one key takeaway that you want the audience to walk away from today's panel to remember? Start on the other side, she says.
The one key thing. Okay, sure. Look, I think, maybe can I do two? Okay, so one of the things in my world, right, because I'm on the mature side, right? I mean, we're commercializing products globally, and one of the realities of this world is you have to put so many companies on the front end and so many ideas that need to be funded, like people like David and Eddie and others, on the front end to kind of bring those ideas through, because some are gonna fall out, right? The efficacy may not be there. It's just the natural way of business. And so what we've been missing for a while is that full front end funnel. And so I'm excited now that we actually have, really dedicated resources to be able to do that. So then by the time it sort of comes to the mature area and sort of ready for commercialization, we've really got a robust cohort. I think the second thing I would say is access. We focus so much on product innovation, getting things from 98% to 99%. But there's just broad swaths of healthcare globally where we still have to make a dent. And so let's innovate for that. And that could be making things simpler, making things more accessible, making things just good enough to have an impact, right? Necessarily achieving, trying to achieve the gold medal for perfection, because we have a lot of work to do.
Well, there's so many things, and we've said a lot of them. So what haven't we said? I think a lot of this starts with the patient. One of the ways that things are broken in women's health is that women don't know, they can't find a provider that will listen to them, or they don't speak about it to begin with. One of the things that really breaks my heart about our vaginismus patient group is that they all think they're the only ones. They've never heard of it, and they don't talk to sometimes they don't even talk to their partners about it. So I think that speaking up with your doctors, getting the women in your life, so for the people who identify as men in the room, if there are women in your life that you love, ask them how they're doing. Make sure they're getting the care that they need, because women tend to not always do that, don't tend to always make time for their own care. So I think that that's an important part of, patient mindfulness along these lines. And I think there's, the other thing is, for those of you who are working in medical device companies, I think there's going to be a time, right? Because it'll take time to change the curriculum in medical school. It'll take time to get the gold standard, the funding for the gold standard trials that we're used to in this space. I think in the meantime, we will need to talk to consumers. And there's not a lot of tolerance for that. We will definitely be talking about that on the Health Equity Initiative, is the role that the consumer plays. Pharma does this pretty well, but it's expensive. There are different margins in pharma. So how do we do this affordably? It'll definitely be a community play. But take that back to your organizations. Like, how could we engage the consumer more with an eye towards access and education and empowerment?
From a business side, I have to bring that perspective. And when I was doing M&A or advisory on that side, we look at it almost like a game of Texas Hold'em poker. How many outs before you get the last card? In other words, how many acquirers are out there? 8, 12, 20. That's really frothy. We have a lot of opportunities. But structural heart, you might have 4 or 5, and there's a lot going on there. And while we might not have a plethora of women's health-focused commercial large entities for exits, the markets are huge. These are huge markets. We were talking about fibroids, and we haven't even approached endometriosis. The numbers there, pelvic congestion, somebody mentioned in the audience, other ovarian conditions, and PCOS, and we could go on forever. These are huge numbers. Breast disease. If we bring the right technologies there, the acquirers will be there, because these are big businesses, and that's what they're interested in, that they're big opportunities, and they can have an ROI, and they can build a commercial organization. I purely coincidentally was talking with a CEO who was a very large part of this conference in his retired and now private equity, and I asked him what some of his biggest ideas and where he wants to look. He said, women's health, of course. So the first time I've heard that from private equity in a while. Why? He said, massive opportunities. That's where we want to be. It's huge opportunities, and we have to be able to get the press and the rest of our colleagues to understand.
I would just say, check out the the opportunity map. I mean, there's a lot of information. I mean, the report is 120-some pages, but the executive summary is about 4. So, so if, you want to light read or long read, you have options. But certainly, take a look at it, and, there's a lot of information, and really, kind of look at it from your perspective and see where you fall in and where you can, kind of plug into looking at, you know, innovation across the lifespan. Because again, we're not just focused on that one section of maternal health. Is, you know, from menses, you know, to old age. So there's a lot of opportunity across the lifespan. So
I did take a quick look at it, and it really is thorough and comprehensive in terms of that holistic picture. It's not just product innovation, it's really about taking apart the challenges that's faced. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. And it's relatively new. It just got pushed out and announced on Sunday. So very new and very fresh, so make sure that you take a look at that.
I'm just happy to be here on the tape, like honestly, right? Who would have ever thought a non-for-profit would be sitting up at a MedTech conference talking about an innovation fund? It's super cool. And
I did.
yeah, Pauline, you did. Yes, you're absolutely right. So, I'm about amplifying. So if you haven't seen or know about the March of Dimes, or you think you knew about the March of Dimes because it was your mother's March of Dimes, it's a little different, as I said, a little bit more sass to it, as I like to say. And what we're trying to do, and where we're trying to go. And so I would say you can always go to the March of Dimes website, and a dime today is $1.85. Imagine if I could do that crowd, right? Funding across the United. I'm not FDR, I'm not going to politics, but so just think about it. Go to our website. We too have tons of data and things that we're doing. There's Innovation Fund, but you could donate $1.85.
And there's a local presence in
Yes.
every single state as well. So there's also that tangible resource within the community. So with that, I wanted to thank all of our panelists. I know that not everyone knew one another, and that was part of the goal that I had in developing this panel with our colleagues, and bringing that unique perspective, and all with the same passionate reason of really embracing and innovating in women's health. It's a big task, it's a big issue. I appreciate a lot of the questions coming from the FDA and others in really helping to support and embracing and amplifying women's health. Thank you.